Why is Richard Carrier so much trouble for Christians? Now, I am not suggesting that I'm going to go into Richard Carrier's motives. And by the way, if you're not familiar with Richard Carrier, he is a Jesus mythicist who writes quite a bit on Jesus not existing as a historical figure and being based upon pagan parallels. And he is considered to be one of the top people in the Jesus Mythicist camp. And what I want to talk about is the way that his writing, his posts, his books affect Christians. Now, I get a lot of emails from people, and you're always welcome to send them. But for those of you who are waiting, yes, I do have a long list of responses that I have to go through, but it's always great to hear from people. But I would say 90% of what gets sent to me has something to do with Richard Carrier. It is, could you respond to this blog post or this video or some statement that Richard Carrier made? And I find that there are people who are really, really struggling with their faith, and they're struggling with their faith because of what Richard Carrier writes. In the past, I've seen some of the ones who have been most damaging to people's faith being people like Bart Ehrman or Richard Dawkins, but I'm seeing a lot more now of Richard Carrier. And by the way, there's some really interesting, I'll say, conversations between Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier. So despite both being, I'm not sure if Bart Ehrman considers himself to be an agnostic or an atheist, but a non-believer, despite that, he is a strong critic of Jesus mythicism. And there's some pretty extensive back and forth between Richard Carrier and Bart Ehrman, and people might find that interesting to take a look at. But I really want to dive into why Richard Carrier has this effect on people. I think one of the reasons is just the fact that he has a PhD in a relevant topic, that is in history. And so he seems to be an insider on that front, that he has the correct credentials to offer an opinion, a scholarly and informed opinion on whether or not Jesus was a historical figure. And so he makes all kinds of statements about history, and people think, well, he does have a PhD in history, so maybe we should be listening to this. And I will say that he is indeed one of the few, and I think despite what Richard Carrier has a list of people on his website that he says are either Jesus mythicists or sympathetic to, and he thinks it's a long list. It's not that long, and a lot of the people will just acknowledge that we cannot know for sure in terms of being able to have concrete evidence, but we don't have that kind of evidence for almost anyone unless the person was an actual leader of a empire. We really cannot know for sure. But anyways, he is one of the few, one of the handful, really, I think I can count on one hand, those who have a PhD in a relevant field. And so that seems to give him a certain level of credibility. So I think that's part of why that his writings really affect Christians in ways that perhaps just an atheist blogger who just happened to come across Jesus mythicism and put out their post on their own blog or published it on some atheist forum saying there was no Jesus. Those kind of people tend to be dismissed quite easily. But Richard Carrier seems to hold more weight. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why he affects people. But there's something else. When I go through his blog posts, Richard Carrier carries himself, no pun intended, carries himself with a high level of confidence in what he says. He doesn't come across as someone who is offering ideas. He is very strongly dismissing the opposite arguments, the arguments for the historicity of Jesus. He will make statements of this is the way it is, with no seeming questions about whether what he is saying is actually correct. And that level of confidence really comes across. There's a good rhetorical effect to that. In fact, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking that in many ways, Richard Carrier reminds me of Donald Trump. And I'm not going to try to get political here, but Donald Trump often sees himself as a political outsider. He's coming from outside the traditional political channels, and he knows that there are people that would look down upon him because of that. And he comes across with this really strong confidence. This is the way it is. He just kind of bursts into a room. And in many ways, that's the way Richard Carrier writes, because despite having a PhD, he is actually an outsider to the scholarly world. And that's because, yes, he has a PhD, but he never has really made it in terms of having a position on a recognized university. A lot of his stuff has been self-published. Nothing wrong with that. I have self-published some things as well. But really, Richard Carrier does not have a position of authority or recognition or respectability in the scholarly world. He wouldn't be recognized, I don't think, at most of the biblical conferences that are out there, or even the mainstream historical conferences, unless it's put on by a specific atheist group or a specific Jesus Mythicist group. I don't think that he is a part of it, unless he's debating someone. In case that case he might be, but his position is definitely a minority position, and I find that people who are kind of pushed into the margins like that come across with more confidence to make up for the lack of respectability of their position. And so that is a part of what's going on. The other thing that I find about Richard Carrier's writings is that he knows the scholarly world enough to make things sound more positive for his side than it really is. So as I scan through his blog posts, he'll say, well, the peer-reviewed literature says this. Well, that's great. Yes, so he can find a peer-reviewed article that seems to support some particular point that he's making. But just because something is peer-reviewed does not mean that it's absolutely true. For example, I can find all kinds of things that are peer-reviewed, and there'll be one that says one thing, and you'll find a peer-reviewed article that'll say the exact opposite. I have a peer-reviewed article that I wrote and had published in a scholarly journal that says the Apostle Paul was aware of the historical Jesus and believed in a historical Jesus. So why can't we just say, well, the peer-reviewed literature says that Jesus was real because I wrote that article? Obviously, he would not accept that. But he makes it sound so good when he'll say they're not listening to what the peer-reviewed article is saying. Peer review just means that someone has put out this article in some journal, and sometimes there are higher journals than others. There are ones that are more respected than others. But anyways, a journal has allowed this to go out there as a point of conversation. And peer reviewed just means that enough research has been done that this can be included in the conversation. That's all it means. Peer reviewed does not mean that this is agreed upon by scholarship, as if there is a monolithic group called the scholars who agree upon everything. That is not the way it is. And so what he says is very much in the margins, and most scholars would not accept it. And of course, he is very dismissive of those who disagree with him, and that's fine. He's welcome to do that. But I wish that people who read his articles would have some understanding of where his position stands in terms of historians in general. So I'm not talking about evangelical Christians. I'm not even talking about Christians or religious people, but just historians in general, the way that they do history, the way biblical studies is done. And a lot of biblical studies is not done by evangelical Christians. And there is a lot of biblical scholarship out there that is written by non-Christians. And even taking all that into account, Richard Carrier's stuff is very small minority. And yes, he is going to get loud. He is going to be aggressive in the way he writes, in the way he communicates. He's going to dismiss people who stubbornly hold on to the belief that Jesus was real, that the tomb was empty, that James was the brother of Jesus, all of these things. He's going to dismiss that and see people who believe that as fools, and yet the majority of scholarship really holds to these things. Maybe the empty tomb is a little bit less, but certainly that James was the brother of Jesus and that Jesus existed and all these other things. Scholarship pretty much agrees upon that. So those are some of my thoughts about why Richard Carrier causes so much trouble for Christians. If you are a Christian and you've encountered his stuff and you find that it's really been harmful to your faith, I want you to know that there is a lot of scholarship that is done that shows that indeed Jesus is real, and there's a lot of evidence for Christian claims. In fact, I would say that one of the biggest problems we have is a lot of scholars refuse to debate or to write against or to respond to Jesus mythicism because it's considered to be laughable and not to be something that is worth scholarly effort. And I've been actually trying to react against that. In fact, I co-wrote this book here, Unmasking the Pagan Christ, with Stanley Porter, who is the president of McMaster Divinity College and a much greater biblical scholar than Richard Carrier will ever be, and much greater than I will ever be as well. So it's not about Richard Carrier. We tackle a different version of Jesus myth, but it will give you some of the background. Also would want to point you towards my website, JesusMythTheory.com, where I focus a lot of that, as well as going to my other website, StephenJBedard.com/apologetics. That will give you some resources as well. I hope that this helps, and I wish God's blessings upon you.